or who's already had a look at DSC? Okay. I'm not going to go too deep into the dev side of everything, because I'm not a developer. My name is David O'Brien. MVP for System Center, Cloud and Data Center Management. Main focus, automation. So everything that can be automated, I try to automate it. Tools of choice, PowerShell, SMA, Orchestrator. Not so much anymore, but still around. Config Manager used to be an ECM and MVP, so Config Manager was, or is still a big part of my day-to-day job.
You have a job?
I've got a job, yeah. You want a cookie?
No.
What? Good question. By the way, great site, Pluralsight. Go check the booth out. Very good training videos on their website. Another good website, davidobrien.net. Good articles on there. My Twitter handle, and I'm a principal consultant at DiligeNet, and that's where I'm from at the moment, at least. So I've just moved there a year ago. Who knows where that is? Who's been there before? It's about 17,500 kilometers away. So that's Melbourne, Australia. Originally from Germany, if you can't tell by my accent. Quick agenda. I'm going to talk about what are resources. Jan Egge has already touched a bit on that. What are they for? Some ground rules if you want to create your own. Some good practices. I'm not going to talk about best practices because best practices already apply to what you think are best practices in your environment. I will have a couple of demos, and I should also have some time in between and at the end for Q&A. So if you've got a question, if it's hard to follow, just ask, and I'll try to answer your question straight away. So actually, Jan Egge's session was the first DSC session I've ever been to where there was no Jean-Luc Picard picture ever. Usually it's DSC and Jean-Luc Picard with his "make it so" statement. So we're going to talk about the "make it so" of PowerShell DSC. And the "make it so" is the smarts behind that configuration document that you usually see, or that the IT pro in the future is going to work with. It's more on the dev side of DevOps, especially for me, because I'm more a scripter than I'm not a developer. I use PowerShell, but I don't develop in PowerShell. But if you're going to take one thing away from the session, it's you don't have to be a developer to use PowerShell DSC. It's really not that hard. And the whole DevOps hype at the minute is maybe just that, a hype. And if you actually go and look at it, it's really not that hard. In my opinion, using DSC is probably going to be second-level jobs. Actually creating PowerShell DSC resources or resources for Chef, Puppet, and all that stuff, that's where the future work's going to be. So, because, like I said, that's where the smarts are in. Jan Egge's touched on that as well a bit, declarative versus imperative syntax in PowerShell. We are very used to imperative syntax, so imperative would be, not that. Add Windows feature. You actually tell PowerShell how to do something. And declarative in PowerShell DSC is the DSC configuration document. So you're not telling PowerShell how to do something, you're just telling it what to do. And it does just makes it so. That makes sense. So what is a resource? Anybody in here already created a PowerShell module before? Yeah. So it's basically that. It does look quite similar to an extent. Inside of a PowerShell DSC resource module, there are PowerShell DSC resources, of course. And one module can house more than one resource, if you like. The way you can find your resources, the resources that are on your system, is by using the get DSC command, DSC resource commandlet. Jan mentioned that on WMF4, there are 12 built-in resources, and on WMF5, there are 15. And the resource enumeration is much faster. Don't know what they did in the back end, but it's much faster, actually. So that would be the output of get DSC resource on a plain vanilla WMF4 machine. So far, so good? Yeah, okay, everybody's still here. That's good as well. So what are they for? Resources are like commandlets. They implement commands and parameters for the DSC engine to understand in the end. So the DSC engine then knows if I get the resource XYZ, how to handle that resource XYZ with parameters ABC. If you create your own, please copy them here to C program files or to your own PowerShell profile or somewhere else, which I'm going to show you in a minute. Do not copy them here. Do not copy them to C Windows. The reason for that is C Windows System 32 and so on. That's not explicitly reserved, but implicitly reserved for Microsoft. If you do something in here, next Windows update could just break everything. So all the built-in resources for PowerShell DC are going to live in C Windows System 32. All the custom resources are in C program files. If you put a custom resource into C program files and you can't find it with get DSC resource, you've either done something wrong, or maybe that KB article isn't installed on your machine. So that could fix something if you haven't done something wrong while creating that resource. And that's an overall topic, I guess, excuse me, is code reuse. So you create a resource, you create modules, you create functions, all for one purpose, code reuse. You make them generic so that you can later on use them in different scenarios. The place or places where you can copy them to is called PS module path. So that's the path, the variable where PowerShell DSC or the get DSC resource function or commandlet, sorry, is going to look for custom resources or built-in DSC resources. If you copy your own module, your own resource somewhere else that's not in PS module path, get DSC resource is not going to find it. You can see that, for example, Azure extends that variable for its own resource. So you can obviously do that yourself as well, if you like, or just copy your resources to C program files. The resource folder structure, or the resource module folder structure looks a bit strange on first sight compared to a standard PowerShell module. The resource itself, the module itself, sorry, is the root folder, and of course we need a module manifest as well. How we're going to create them, I'm going to show you that in a minute in a demo. The difference to build in or to standard regular PowerShell modules is this folder. You need to have that folder, otherwise the getDEC resource will not recognize that module as a DEC module. And it has to be called exactly that, DEC resources, even if there's only one in there. Very common mistake if you start creating your own DEC resource modules to forget that or to misspell it, and quite a few forum articles on the internet about that. Each and every resource then is going to be a subfolder of DEC resources. And the way we have to name them is defined in a schema.morph file. I'm going to have a look at that morph file in a bit. And the actual logic, the actual resource logic, is in your module file, the PSM1. Make sense so far? Gonna have a look at some code later on. So that's a regular DEC resource. That's one as well. Looks quite different. We again have our resource name, the module name. We have our module manifest, the DEC resources folder. But then we're missing the schema.morph file. The reason for that, is that known? Does anybody know what kind of resource that is? That's a composite resource. That takes the code reuse even a bit further than just a regular resource like on the left. So here we've got not a schema.morph, but a schema.psm1. And, which something that's optional, the module manifest for a resource. Something that you've probably already seen quite a few times is that you need to have at least those three functions in a resource. If you've used the script resource, the built-in script resource before, you know that there's a set, test, and get step in that script resource. That kind of simulates what a proper resource does. So you need to build those three functions inside your resource, and they need to have a defined output value. The test target resource needs to output a Boolean true or false. The set target resource doesn't really need to have any output. And the get target resource, although it doesn't play any role in the execution phase, needs to output a hash table, or it needs to output a hash table if it does output anything, with the current values on that system you're testing on. And they all require to accept the same set of parameters. So the execution phase, and you've seen that before, so I'm going to rush through that. The execution phase starts, test target resource runs, and test target resource outputs false. So the system is not in its desired state. So set target resource needs run and finishes after that. If test target resource outputs true, then the system is already in its desired state. There's nothing to be done. So directly straight goes to end. So we're going to have a look at the actual functions inside of the resource. The test target resource makes sense. It checks the current state of the system. And like I said, outputs a Boolean true or false value. Depending on true or false, it then goes on to set target resource, or it just goes on to end. What's important here is that you remember that principle of idempotence. So idempotence, no matter how often you run something, the outcome shouldn't change if the system, the underlying system, hasn't changed. So if I tell a DSC to check for a service if it's running, if that service is already running, test target resource should return true. It should always return true as long as that service is running. It shouldn't, for whatever reason, at some point return false. Otherwise, that principle of idempotence wouldn't be followed. So that's one example of a custom resource, as target resource. What's interesting here is, I mentioned that the get target resource function isn't used in the execution phase. I still don't really understand why Microsoft has implemented the get target resource. I can only guess that there's something common in the future where that's handy. Anyway, what a lot of people do, because get target resource is supposed to check the system for its current state and return a hash table. Because of that, a lot of people use or call get target resource instead of test target resource and use that further on for the check if the system's already in its desired state or not. Make sense? No questions? No cookies. I'm not taking them back to Australia, so actually, why not? It's a long flight. So set target resource must only run if test target resource returns false and brings the system either into its desired state or back to its desired state if there was configuration drift. And it doesn't have any output. Set target resource, and that's what I meant by declarative versus imperative. If you're going to create your own DC resources, we again are talking about imperative scripting syntax. So now we're actually telling DC or telling PowerShell how to do something. And that's just an example of how to create that set target resource. Mentioned the get target resource doesn't take part in the execution process. So most implementations either ignore it or use it in the test target resource phase. And again, just an example from I think it's the X time zone resource, how to query the current state of that system. And if you follow that, all those functions have the output type set to the actual type of output that function has to give. And they all use that one parameter, time zone. So if you have 10 parameters for your resource, every single function, so get, set, and test target resource, needs to accept those 10 parameters. You don't necessarily have to do anything with them, but if you don't provide the function with that parameter, you're going to get an error. So in your set target resource, you might get into a situation where whatever you did, you have to invoke a reboot. So you can do that quite easily by setting a DSC machine status global variable to 1. Pretty easy. After the execution phase, DSC is going to check for that variable. If that's set to 1, it's going to either invoke a reboot, or depending on how you've configured your local configuration manager, just output a message saying that machine needs to reboot to complete the configuration. Word of warning, make sure test target resource works properly. If you set that variable in your set target resource to 1, and test target resource has an error or doesn't work properly and always returns false for whatever reason, you will always run into set target resource, and DSC is always going to reboot your server. So just be aware of that. So we've heard that DSC in PowerShell is just a domain-specific language sitting or inside of PowerShell, abstracting the MOF engine from us. So we don't have to create the MOF files while creating the configuration document. In this case, at least for WMF4, as long as we don't have WMF5, we have to create a MOF file. There's ways of working around that with some community functions, but we, one way or the other, have to create a MOF file. And that MOF file describes the resource. It describes and implements the parameters that resource accepts. And that would be one example of a MOF file for the DNS server resource module. And in this case, that would create a secondary zone in DNS. There are a couple of important values in here, like the friendly name. So the friendly name is actually the name you use in your configuration block in PowerShell. So don't make it too cryptic, so people in the end won't be able to use it. You have to define a class name that can be the same as the friendly name, but Microsoft uses MSFT underscore whatever. Some people use their company name underscore whatever. I sometimes just use my name. So it's up to you. Important thing is that class that you're creating needs to derive from OMI base resource. That changed a while ago. So there are still some articles around on the internet saying that it has to derive from a different class or from a different namespace. But now, since a couple of months ago, it has to be OMI-based resource. All the rest in here are your parameters. And they're pretty self-explanatory. So the name parameter is the key parameter. So that's how DSC is going to enumerate if that's already there. You can specify if that is a string or an integer or something else. A key parameter. If it's required, if you can write that parameter, or if it's just a read parameter. One thing that's interesting is the ensure parameter. So you've probably all have already come across the ensure parameter, so you can tell DSC, make sure that that setting or that configuration is present on that machine. So ensure that file exists, or ensure that it's absent. And in here, Microsoft has implemented the value map, where you can specify the allowed values for that parameter. The morph file needs to be called after the class name .schema.morph. So whatever you put in here, the class name, that's what goes into the file name. We also need to create the module manifest. Very handy, there's already a built-in PowerShell commandlet to use that we can use for that. It's the same for PowerShell modules that we can use for PowerShell DSC. It's required, and it's especially important for pull servers, for pull mode, because your PowerShell module or module manifest is going to have the module version in it, and the client will check on the pull server if he's got the latest version of that resource. If the module version on the pull server is higher than the one the client has, it's going to pull the resource down. With that, I'm going to go and show you a couple of scripts. So, can everybody see that? Yep, nodding, great. Oop. So there's a function on Git. If you don't know Git, go have a look at GitHub. Apparently the thing to know in 2015. I still have to learn quite a bit about that, but there's a function called new morph file. What that does is it looks at your module and creates the schema.morph for you. So if we go and, not here, so this, open up in here. So this resource accepts a couple of parameters. Quite a few, actually. That's a resource I've created for Config Manager. So with that resource, I can create, or I can install and configure a new Config Manager primary set. So if you're interested in that, just come to me after that session, or just go onto my blog. It's available there. So the new morph file function is going to pass through that module and then check all the parameters and create the schema.morph file. So if I run this, that makes sense. And now we've got a schema.mov file. And it's already created that for us. So in the beginning, I actually sat down and wrote those MOV files by hand. And that's not a fun work to do. If you've ever done that before, it's really not. So that's already a good starting point. You can see, compared to what we had before, there are some things in here missing, like description, value maps, values, and so on and so on. So you really want to go back in here. And by the way, don't go and edit your MOV file in PowerShell ISE. It looks nice, but it's going to break the MOV file. So always use Notepad or Notepad++. It's about because of the encoding. Same with the module manifest. Who knows what that technique is called? Splatting. Perfect. Who was that? Go get yourself a cookie. Pro tip, go ask for hot milk, break them in half, and suck the milk through the cookie. Most disgusting thing ever, but brilliant. Where was I? Yeah, the module manifest. So I specify all those parameters and then go and create my module manifest. In here. So that's just been created, 10:53 p.m. So that's still my time zone. It still feels like that's my time zone, which is pretty crap, by the way. And it creates the module manifest for us. So that's some tasks that you can automate, which will make your life a bit easier while creating those resources. By the way, in some of my sessions before, I sometimes said, yeah, we don't really care what DSC does because we're using the Windows feature resource, for example. You can actually go and check what that resource is doing. So just like we are creating our custom resource, Microsoft had to go and create the resources as well. So if you've ever asked yourself, what is Microsoft using to create or to install a Windows feature, they're using add Windows feature. So they're not using DISM, they're actually using PowerShell. So, where is it? So, that's a configuration document that you should have already seen, or something like that you should have already seen before. You've got the configuration keyword, and then some stuff in here. So, question would be, why do we even bother creating our own resources? And this would be a reason why. that resource, or that configuration document is used to install Config Manager. Installs a couple of Windows features, quite a few actually. Installs a couple of packages. Uses a custom resource that I've already created. And a script resource. Config Manager is always the same. As long as you stick to the single primary site, everything on that machine, a Config Manager installation will, in 99.5% of all cases, always look alike. So that's actually a good candidate to create your own resource for. So in this case, I've already created a resource, the CM primary site resource, which is inside of that C Config Manager 2012 module. By the way, there's a naming convention. The built-in modules will always have a MSFT or don't have any prefix. Experimental resources will always start with an X, and community resources will always start with C. So if you go and create your own resource, upload it to the internet, to Git, for example, or GitHub, make sure you start your module name with a C. So that configuration uses a lot of already built-in resources, and they will always be the same. As long as Microsoft doesn't change how Config Manager is going to be installed, they will always be the same. That's why now, that's the configuration document, how I now go and install Config Manager. So instead of using or going through around about 200 lines of PowerShell code each and every time, and then realizing nothing's changed, there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 3, 6, 8. 8 variables that I have to change in order to do all this. And that's because I've created a composite resource. And a composite resource, I've already shown you the example of Firefox before. A composite resource looks similar to regular resources, but for the missing schema.mov file, and which is now replaced by the schema.psm1. And the schema.psm1 is actually our configuration document that we've used before, copied and used as a module. So we're reusing already existing resources in our resource. So we're reusing what other people already had. Instead of creating everything ourselves, we reuse code. Why reinvent the wheel? And why make it so complicated for people to use your code? So why would we use this if we can go and use this? Much easier. So, good on time. Like I said, some good practices. In my opinion, there aren't really that many best practices already around for DSC. One reason is because not a lot of companies, at least on Windows, are using DSC. And DSC is only, how old is it? 18 months. So it's still a baby. So we still have to figure out, and also Microsoft needs to figure out how DSC is going to use in production. There are a couple of things, though, that you should be doing, like export module member. In your module, you can specify which functions you want to export and make available to the public. In this case, the PowerShell. Usually for PowerShell DEC, you only need to export the asterisk target resource functions. Everything else in your module, I can show you an example of what I mean. So down here, I've got a region where I'm creating an ini file, which I'm using in my set target resource. So that function is used in the set target resource. It wouldn't make much sense exporting that and making that available outside of the module. So I don't need to specify or don't need to export that. If it applies to your use case, not so much to config manager in my case, but if it does for you, please add the ensure parameter to your module. So to give users of your resource the capability of making sure that something's there or not. Important is, if you do that, then your set target resource and your get target resource needs to be aware of that. So depending on what the user uses, ensure absent or present, your functions need to be aware of that and be able to execute on that. With all that in mind, test target resource should be fast. And I mean very fast, because every configuration that's applied to a machine gets re-evaluated quite regularly. So if your test target resource, worst case, has a sleep in there for 20 minutes, just pulling something out of thin air, that wouldn't be good. It's never good, but that would be really not good. Because test target resource should only check, is my system in the desired state or not. It shouldn't really do anything. It should just get a setting, and that's it. And that's as fast as possible. Yeah, because it's called with every consistency check, which runs every 15 minutes, I believe. Applies to every function, every script you write, but validate your input parameters. Validate if that what a user puts into the parameter values is actually something that you can work with. Makes sense, especially here. Please do use write verbose, not write host, but write verbose. It makes troubleshooting a lot easier. So if you do something, tell the user what you're doing. That's something that some of my ex-colleagues in Germany who are developers told me quite regularly, because I didn't really follow that when I started with PowerShell. Always ever only do one thing. A function is there to do one thing, and one thing only. If you need to go and connect to a SQL database, and then create the database, and then rename it, and then whatever, that's not one function. The functions would be connect to SQL, create table, create database, create table, and so on and so on. That would be functions. Same for DSC. There is no, or there shouldn't be, for example, your resource shouldn't go and use add Windows feature. That's what Windows feature is there for. So if something's missing, don't go and do it. Tell the user, hey, there's something missing. And then the user should go and specify the Windows feature resource in the configuration document. And something that's quite handy, Microsoft gave us a couple of functions for DSC resource testing. There's a designer kit available somewhere. I can find the links and put them on Twitter, on my blog. Most of my scripts are on my blog anyway, so, and the slides will go up there as well. But test XDSC resource is quite handy. Where is it? Test XDSC resource. Name. What's it called? Not this one. The because it's not a resource. Specified the module. That should work. I can tell you it worked before. Like always with demos. It worked before. It comes back with true. For whatever reason, there are errors in here, but it comes back with true. Test XDSC resource would go and check if your MOV file is correct, if the MOV file uses all the parameters, or the other way around. If your module uses all the parameters that you've specified in the MOV file, if there are any syntax errors in your MOV file, and so on and so on. So after you go and create your modules, use that function to test what you've done.
Didn't you use a clean environment when you were doing testing instead of the ISE? Because you now might have screwed up some variables.
I probably have, yeah. Can give it a go in here. I think that's why. No. Actually, that's a good example of there are issues with that resource. So it tells me what the issues are, and then in the end, false. There's something wrong with your resource, basically. That's what it's saying. Nice. So, like I said, what I want to give you, or the message I want to give you is, DC resources aren't that much different to PowerShell modules. Go reuse your code. If you've created a function, if you've created a module somewhere, try to make it as generic as possible and reuse it somewhere else. I guess, and I've already been in those situations, developers laugh at my code because I don't write code, I write scripts. I'm a scripter, I'm not a developer, but I'm still able to write those PowerShell DSC resources. It's not that hard. It takes a while maybe to get your head around it, but it's really not that hard. More than one way to skin the cat. It's always a better way, a different way. It really depends on your situation. And something very important, it's not always DSC if you're talking about automation. Even though PowerShell has built up towards DSC over the last couple of years and versions, it doesn't always have to be DSC. I think Jan Egel said that in his session. Think before you automate. What do you want to automate? Does it even make sense to go through the maybe even hassle to create a module if it's only a one-off thing? So I wanted to show you one more thing. In PowerShell 5, there's a new way to create PowerShell DSC resources. And I'm going to show you how that would look like. Problem is, it's not going to work. For whatever reason, so I'm on PowerShell or WMF 5 November preview. And I've been in contact with a couple of PowerShell guys the whole morning to figure out why it's not working. That's the example of a hosts file resource made of classes. So in PowerShell 5, you can now use classes, or you can now define classes and use them to create your DSC resource. One nice thing about that is you don't have to create your schema.morph file anymore. That's obsolete. But for whatever reason, on my machine at least, feedback I got was, yeah, it doesn't work on Windows 10, on the Windows 10 version of PowerShell, but it should work on the November version, on, this is Windows Server 2012 R2. It doesn't. So that's the example. If you want to test it, that exact example is on PowerShell Magazine by Ravi Kant. He's put that on there to show you how to use classes in PowerShell to create your DSC resources. Would have liked to show you how that works, but it doesn't work. So there's still 17 cookies left. 17 questions, please. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming here. I really enjoyed that. Was my first NIC. Quite a long way for me to get here. I'm still here the whole day, leaving tomorrow morning. Only 28 hours trip. And yeah, hope to see you here again next year. And have fun with PowerShell DSC, of course.